Gorgeous. Gorgeous. Absolutely beautiful. I'm gonna run to the sunset. I wish I could run to the sunset. That'd be nice. Uber Eats. Uber Eats. Somebody's got towed, bro. Shoot. Wouldn't want that to be me. Would not want that to be me, bro. But we got the view. We got the view. That's what matters. We got the view. Oh my gosh, it's windy. You know, I was learning in my ecology class about the wind, how the wind comes about. So there's this thing where, all right, let's start from the top. So there's these, you know, where do I even start? So much information. Okay. So you know how like in the equator, right? That's whenever the sun hits directly over such a small area. That's why it's so hot there, right? So at the equator, there's these things called Hadley cells. And those Hadley cells are formed whenever the sun's rays pass through the atmosphere and they heat up like the air there, right? And that causes the air to get hot, right? And that hot air rises up and it expands. And it expands because it has a lot of kinetic energy. It's like you had a bunch of like kids on a sugar rush and they're bouncing around everywhere. That's what it's like, right? Because you're giving them energy. Likewise, the air, when hit directly by the sun, gets energy. And then as it rises, there's a pressure difference. Because as you get higher up in the atmosphere, there's less stuff holding you down, right? So there's less pressure. And when there's less pressure, there's less stuff holding you down, and it contributes to that expansion. And as you get higher up, it also gets colder. So the air begins to, gets cold. And when it gets cold, that air, it also has water vapor. And that water vapor starts to condense because it's getting cold, right? And that's how you form clouds and rain. And that cold air actually holds on to less water than hot air, because you're removing all the heat out of it. You're removing all the energy. So it wants to come back down. And they have this fancy term called the adiabatic effect. And that's what happens, and it starts to rain. But, my point here is that that air that was rising it starts to circulate back down. And since all the rain and water is out of that air, now it's dry. And that dry air is also cool. So when it comes back down, you get dry, cool air. And that dry, cool air is usually around 30 degrees north and south of the equator, right? That's why we see continental deserts at around 30 degrees north and south latitude on the globe, right? In addition to those Hadley cells, there's also these things called polar cells. And those polar cells are found at the poles of the globe, you know, North and South Pole. And, you know, same thing. That cold air rushes down and it causes this like circulation. Then there's this other cell called the Ferrel cell. That's like in between the polar and Hadley cell. Anyway, that's how you get like those like winds, right? But there's also these things called like trade winds. And this thing called like the Coriolis effect. And you know, it's not what the cells I described to you, that's like without taking into account the rotation of the earth. Now if you take into account the rotation of the earth, that's when you start to get trade winds, right? They call these things they give them funny names like easterlies and westerlies. And the names derive from where the wind is coming from. So if the wind is coming from the east, it's called an easterly. It's coming from the west, it's called a westerly. It's coming from the northeast, northeasterly. Stuff like that, you know. And also, you also got to take into account the geography, the topography, the land, the water. Because, you know, during the summer, like land masses that are close to water, they have more moderate temperatures because that water absorbs a lot of that heat, right? Man, I'm gonna do another run because I didn't finish talking. So that heat takes more heat. Well, like the water can absorb more heat, right? And so the water is cooler than the land. And during the winter time, the water is warmer than the land. So, in summary, water takes longer to heat up, but it also takes longer to cool down. That's why it's cooler. That's why the water's cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. And that temperature difference also affects the air surrounding it, right? So, for example, let's say it's summertime and you're looking at the air that's above the water, and that air is going to be colder than the one on the land because the water's colder, right? And so you know, things like to go from high concentrations to low concentrations, or high pressure differences to low pressure differences. So that cold air that's above the water is going to flow from the water towards the land. And now if you take into, now we can switch this around by taking into account the land during the winter, right? During the winter time, now the land is cooler than the water. And so that air that's above the land is going to be cooler, and the wind or the air is going to flow from the land to the water now. So it's the opposite direction than what it was in the summer. And yeah, that was a very bad explanation. I was all over the place, to be honest. But you know, you get the point. You get the point. Stay tuned for my lecture on, I don't know, I got an astronomy test coming up. I want to tell you how to calculate the mass of the Earth and the Sun, and how to find the distance from the Earth to the Moon, how to find the circumference of the Earth and stuff. But that's for another day, because today is over. It is nighttime. The Earth has almost completed its 24-hour rotation. So I also complete my 24-hour rotation. Peace.